Hello, everybody, and welcome back. This is going to be a hopefully pretty short lecture to give you a feel for the politics surrounding the film we're going to watch, The Wind That Shakes the Barley. And we're going to do that through the story of James Connolly, who's not a character in the film in person, but he is always kind of there in spirit and in the background. Real quick, the image you see here of this flag, we know it as the Big Dipper, Little Dipper, but it's known as the Starry Plough in the UK and Ireland. And a different flag that incorporated the Starry Plough but doesn't look exactly like this, but this is the modern version of it, was created for the Irish Citizen Army, which we're going to talk about later in the lecture, which was the army organized, co-founded by James Connolly, a little militia organization. So it's always been associated with socialist politics from the very beginning. And today, it is still used by socialist organizations in Ireland. This is an updated version of the flag. So you can basically think of this as the flag of Irish socialism and Irish socialists in general. All right, so who was James Connolly? Well, James Connolly was a writer, an organizer, an activist, and a Marxist intellectual. He was born in Edinburgh, it's who knows, which is the primary city in Scotland, but to poor Irish parents. So he was born in Scotland and he grew up in Scotland, but he grew up in an Irish slum within Edinburgh. They were working class parents and they lived in the part of Edinburgh that was occupied almost exclusively by poor Irish immigrants. Now, because he grew up quite poor, he was low on options on how to make a living once he was a young man. So he ended up joining the British Army. And while there, he develops a lifelong hatred for the British Army and everything that it represents. And he quits when his regiment was reassigned to India. He refused to go to India with the British Army. And for a while, came back to Edinburgh, bounced around a little bit, tried to be a cobbler, right, someone who fixes shoes, but really finds his calling getting deeply involved in socialist politics. And when he hears an invitation from a socialist organization in Dublin, Ireland, to work for them, he quickly takes up the offer and he moves his family, he had married by then, to Dublin. And in Dublin, his career for what we know him for really takes off. He becomes an active journalist. He quickly converted the Irish Socialist organization that hired him to a Republican socialist organization, which in the politics of Ireland this time, if you were a Republican, what that meant is that you were opposed to being a part of Great Britain, right? You opposed to the form of constitutional monarchy that Great Britain represented, and it was basically a position of independence, right, for the Irish Republic. And after he becomes active in Ireland and Irish politics, he also goes to America for a while and spends time organizing over there. He was a member of the International Workers of the World, and he also organized Irish socialist organizations in America. There was a large group of Irish organizations formed around political issues in America, right? Because there were so many Irish Americans there. So he spent some time in America as well. Now, all this time he is writing and he's becoming very influential. And James Connolly represents a very specific strain, if you will, in both Irish nationalist and Irish socialist politics, because what he really hopes to do is fuse them. So Irish nationalism, right, was the call for complete freedom and independence from Britain, right? And Irish socialism, of course, was an anti-capitalist position that called for a socialist organization or socialist form, right, of government and society in Ireland. And James Connolly argues that it's necessary to break away from Britain in order to achieve the socialist vision. And he is very much supportive of Irish independence. But he always prioritized socialism, and nationalism was something that was necessary, but it was sort of something that had to happen in order to bring around the socialist republic. But on the other hand, if you brought around independence for Ireland, but without creating a socialist republic, James Connolly really felt that there would be no point to that, right? That just sort of nominal independence from Britain, technical independence, was not the true independence that he sought and others like him sought. They sought a form of independence that was social and economic as well. So basically independence from the capitalist system that Great Britain represented. And this is really excellently captured in this very famous passage from James Connolly's writings. And it appears in the film. It is quoted by two of the characters in a very pivotal scene. So I'm going to go ahead and read the full quote to you so your ears will prick up a little bit and you'll notice it a little bit more in the film. So the passage goes like this. If you remove the English army tomorrow and hoist the green flag over Dublin Castle, unless you set about the organization of the Socialist Republic, your efforts would be in vain. England would still rule you. She would rule you through her capitalists, through her landlords, through her financiers, through the whole array of commercial and individualist institutions she has planted in this country and watered with the tears of our mothers and the blood of our martyrs. So this is a position, right, the Connolly is very clearly taking, that independence is not enough. That if you're going to replace a set of English elites with a set of Irish elites that will continue the same exploitative practices that were extremely widespread in Ireland. They had a huge problem with poverty in places like Dublin. The working class just lived in unbelievably crowded and unsanitary conditions, and the workers were paid horribly low wages. Connolly is saying if you don't do something to address that, there's no heart and soul, right, to our independence. Now, Connolly played a particularly important role during what is known as the Dublin lockout. This is also very briefly mentioned in the film. Now, to make a long story short, the Dublin lockout was a conflict between labor and capital over unionization. The owners of the docking and transportation industries refused to allow their workers to unionize, and there was a very strong push going on for unionization. And in order to resist their drive for unionization, the employers locked out all of their employees and employed strikebreakers instead. So they effectively locked out, right, thousands of workers in Dublin, preventing them from going to work, right, and making a living because there was such a unionization drive that was underway that they were determined to crush, and this is how they responded. The dispute lasted for 6 months, from the summer of 1913 to the start of 1914. Now, during the lockout, Connolly co-founds what's known as the Irish Citizen Army. And that was basically a volunteer militia that was there to defend the workers and the unionists. During the lockout, there were huge protests, drives at unionization, and there were high levels of violence during the lockout. And on a couple of occasions, the Dublin police attacked and ended up killing union activists. So the Irish Citizen Army was Connolly's attempt, right, to organize some citizen resistance to give some backbone to the union and labor movement. However, it failed. It was settled in favor of the employers. And not too long later, actually almost immediately, World War I really gets underway. And World War I is devastating for socialist solidarity. We're going to read more about World War I in our reading today, but here I want to emphasize that whereas before World War I, most socialist organizations had an emphasis on internationalism, right? Not choosing nationalism over class, right? Nationalism over class or worker solidarity. The vast majority of European socialist parties and organizations ended up supporting their country in the war effort, which just really devastated the collective solidarity and attempt to organize on an international scale in Europe. So, in this atmosphere, Connolly is kind of casting around to find some place for hope, and he and other nationalists plan an uprising during Easter week in 1916. It happens to be during Easter that year. It's actually the last week of April in terms of how it would be on the calendar. It's usually referred to just as the Easter Rising rather than attaching to particular dates in April. This image here you see on the left is the declaration that they declared. So they basically seized a primary governmental building in Dublin and declared the independence of the Irish country. And it was a pretty small group of people who did this, and Connolly was among them. So a couple days of intense fighting goes on between British troops and the English army and the army that the rebellion had organized, known as the Irish Republican Army. It goes on for a couple of days, and eventually they have to surrender, the Irish rebels. And they are also then almost all executed, the leaders of this rebellion, and that includes Connolly. So he is killed in a prison in Dublin in 1916. However, despite this short-term failure, what the Rising really does is galvanizes the whole country for armed resistance to achieve Irish independence. Before the Rising, most people wanted some form of independence, but a sort of more moderate parliamentary approach was the primary strategy at the time. And Connolly and many, many others didn't feel like that was sufficient, and that would only get a sort of worthless version of independence in any ways, even if it's successful. So that's why they decided, right, to take this armed resistance route to try to force the issue. And beforehand, it wasn't something that had a huge amount of popular momentum behind it. But after the Rising, especially because of the execution of the leaders, which was extremely alienating to the Irish people, it made them very, very angry, to put it more simply. It sparks a new wave of resistance, and the war for independence really begins in earnest. Now, the political arm of the Party of Independence is called Sinn Féin, Sinn Féin. I'm not quite sure on the pronunciation. Don't speak Irish. And that actually means ourselves alone. So even in the name of this party, right? And they're saying ourselves alone. They're claiming their independence, their autonomy as a nation. And the military arm of the War for Independence is known as the Irish Republican Army, or you may have also heard of it as the IRA. So the Civil War, especially by 1918, or not the Civil War, excuse me, the War for Independence against Great Britain is really underway. Now, in 1922, after several years of mostly guerrilla warfare, a treaty is negotiated which makes Ireland a free state, but requires an oath of allegiance to the crown. So it still keeps Ireland within the official kingdom, if you will, of Great Britain. So they had to swear an oath of allegiance to the king. and keeps Northern Ireland a part of Britain. I'm not going to go into the details of Northern Ireland in this lecture because then it would just balloon out of control and we'd bite off more than we can chew. But suffice to say, Northern Ireland had a great many more number of Protestants than the rest of the country for historical reasons. They'd been sent there to settle Ireland, largely from Scotland, so lots of Scotch Irish. So there was a large chunk of the population, just about half in Northern Ireland, who did not want to break away from Britain. It's very complicated politics up there, but the treaty that was negotiated in 1922 made sure that the Northern Ireland stayed a part of Great Britain. Okay, so many in the IRA and throughout the country, but especially in the IRA, refused to accept the treaty. And there's a vote held, and it barely passes in the Irish Parliament. But the IRA felt that it was done under conditions of fear and intimidation, so they don't accept the vote. And you eventually get the outbreak of civil war. Now, on the left here, you'll see a flyer that was passed out during the Civil War from what were called the anti-treatyite irregulars. The irregulars meant they were irregular members of the IRA, right? They were IRA members who were no longer following orders, since the official IRA followed the government orders of the new Irish Free State after this treaty was confirmed by Parliament. And of the people who resisted the ratification of the treaty, who did not accept this Free State compromise that Great Britain offered, they had very different reasons for doing so. There was different groups, different motivations for rejecting this treaty. And this particular flyer, even though nobody knew it at the time, is actually a good example of that. Because this man here, Dan Breen, who was a leader of the anti-treatyite irregulars, would later be sympathetic to fascism and the Nazi Party. So he's definitely not coming at his rejection of the treaty from a left or socialistic perspective. He actually later said, "I fought for freedom, not for democracy," but rather from kind of a hardcore nationalist, "I'm not going to swear an oath, right, to a king when I've just fought for, however many years to be independent from the British Crown," kind of position. Whereas the opposition that we'll see depicted in the film, the one that shakes the barley, is largely focused on the perspective of socialist opposition. So people have different reasons for rejecting the treaty, but a good enough portion of the old IRA does so to create this Civil War. Now, the Civil War is brief. It only lasts a year or two. But, of course, it's very painful for the Irish people, which is something that I think will definitely come through in the film. You have former comrades, becoming enemies and finding themselves on the opposite sides of the issue. In any case, the goal of complete independence from Britain, oh, by the way, the Free Staters win, right? The anti-treaty group is defeated within a year or two. Barely takes 2 years. I think the actual fighting itself is about a year and a half. But in any case, the goal of complete independence from Britain is slowly achieved by policy changes. Some old anti-treaty IRA folks who weren't executed, because some of them ended up being executed by the Free State Army. Some of them survive, though, and they would even go on to win office, and one of them even becomes prime minister, and he undoes a lot of the treaty. So bit by bit, it kind of gets picked away anyways. And by 1948, finally, officially, Ireland is no longer a part of Great Britain. It becomes an independent republic, and the Republic of Ireland is declared. However, Northern Ireland remains and is to this day still a part of the United Kingdom, or Great Britain, if you will. So that issue remains. Now, conflict over Northern Ireland continues well into the 20th century, but as I mentioned, that's too complicated to go into here, but I did want to mention it. It is still not entirely resolved. It's still a source of tension. But since 1998, with the Good Friday Agreement, it's settled down into a peace settlement where we haven't really seen these sporadic outbursts of violence known as the Troubles, particularly in the 1970s, that we did see later in the 20th century. However, though, less ambiguous is that Ireland remains most definitely within the capitalist fold. For decades and decades, there was a very acute poverty problem there. For decades after the War for Independence, there were kind of poorhouses, really workhouses, especially for single pregnant women, set up by the Catholic Church that often where people endured horrible abuse and neglect. The economy started doing much better in Ireland during the late 1990s and early 2000s, but they were hit hard once again by 2008, like much of the world was in the Great Recession. And they're still recovering from that at the moment. It seems like Sinn Féin, which actually kind of became almost obsolete for a long time, is coming back to predominance, but it's not quite clear what the future of Irish economic politics will be. But certainly the vision of people like Connolly has not been anywhere near realized. This is a statue, it's kind of monument, a full monument, for James Connolly in Dublin. And if you can read behind there, it's a famous quote of his where he said, "The cause of labor is the cause of Ireland. The cause of Ireland is the cause of labor." So again, he really fused socialist and nationalist politics, and to him, the heart and soul of any Irish independence worth having was a socialist independence, right, where the means of production and the structure of the economy would be drastically different from what they are under a capitalist regime. Okay, so that's James Connolly. Oh, by the way, if you note also behind him, you can see the starry plough, and that design there is what was on the original flag for the Irish Citizen Army, for which he co-founded. All right, so real quickly on the movie. So, just to give you a sense of where we step into this historical timeline, the movie begins in the midst of the War for Independence, and it takes place in Cork and the surrounding county Cork. And this map here to your left, the darker green, that is County Cork. Cork itself, it's not labeled on the map, but the large bay you see there over towards the right, or I guess that would be the west right of the County Cork. Cork's right above that bay, not surprisingly, right? That's where cities usually often are, big cities. And Cork's not that big, but it's the biggest city in Cork County. So that's where it takes place. Almost all the actors, incidentally, come from Cork. Just kind of a funny detail, because the director, a very famous director named is Ken Loach, wanted their language and their accents to be very authentic to the place. And let's see, what else was I going to say here? All right, also, the film will give you a good feel for how the IRA fought a guerrilla-style warfare that depended on the assistance and sympathy of Irish civilians. Right? Guerrilla warfare is a form of warfare that is effective when you have a weaker, smaller force than what you're fighting, but you're fighting on your own turf, your home territory, so you know the terrain better, and you have the help and the support, right, of the civilian population. You'll see how important that is in the film. Things like safe houses, right, and being assured of the support of local people. The IRA units, which would carry out guerrilla actions against the British Army, were known as flying columns because they could come together, carry out an operation, and then disband very easily, and they'd all go their separate ways until they came back together again to once again carry out another operation. So it was hard to track, right? It was hard to, figure out who your enemy was and catch them, so to speak, or how else would you put it? Catch them if you're the British Army. And these flying columns became a very famous part of Irish lore about the war, and they're a source of a lot of pride, right, in sort of Irish myth and legend, if you will. Not necessarily that's not true, right, but Irish memory about the war. Now, as I mentioned in the email, I highly recommend watching this movie with subtitles if at all possible, just because it'll really relieve you from the strain of catching everything they say. But it's not like impossible, right, to follow along without subtitles. All right, so that'll be it, and looking forward to reading your thoughts and responses in discussion this week.